China just lost $23 billion in 48 hours. The asset: 2 port terminals controlling 40% of U.S. imports. The mechanism: treaty enforcement disguised as regulatory review. There are 5 levers that just liquidated China's port empire in Panama, and I'm going to show you each one. Picture the boardroom at C.K. Hutchison Holdings, Hong Kong, January 2025. On the screen, real-time cargo manifests from Balboa and Cristobal terminals. 14,000 vessels annually, every container logged. 25-year concession, expires 2022. Seemed locked in. Then Panama's regulatory agency sends the notice. Security review initiated under Canal Zone neutrality provisions. 30 days to respond. The lawyers pull the 1977 treaty text, page 47, Article 9. Host nation may terminate concessions if U.S. deems canal operations compromise hemispheric security. No compensation required if threat criteria met. The $23 billion in terminal infrastructure? Stranded asset overnight. The question isn't whether the liquidation holds. It's whether anyone notices the treaty backdoor before the next $1 trillion in Chinese infrastructure gets the same treatment. This is lever 1, geographical monopoly. Here's why this matters to you. 40% of containerized goods heading to the U.S. East Coast pass through the Panama Canal because no alternative exists at comparable cost. That's $270 billion in annual cargo. Toys, electronics, car parts, furniture. All forced through an 8-mile choke point. If the entity controlling that choke point can inspect, delay, or reroute cargo, they hold leverage over your cost of living. In 1997, a Hong Kong logistics conglomerate called Hutchison Ports secured 25-year concessions to operate both the Atlantic and Pacific side container terminals. The company, privately held but with board members linked to PRC state logistics networks. The asset: operational control over the inspection and routing of every container transiting the canal. The genius of the deal wasn't the terminals themselves, it was the choke point position. Picture a map of the Western Hemisphere. Draw every container route from Shanghai to New York, Houston to Hamburg. They all converge at one 50-mile corridor. Now consider the alternative. Routing cargo around Cape Horn adds 8,000 miles and 21 days transit time. Suez Canal route adds 12 days and exposes cargo to Red Sea piracy risk. For time-sensitive consumer goods, holiday inventory, just-in-time manufacturing components, perishable pharmaceuticals, Panama isn't an option. It's the only option. Here's how geographical monopolies create intelligence leverage. When a container ship approaches Balboa Terminal on the Atlantic side, the terminal operator receives advanced manifest data. Shipper, consignee, cargo description, destination port. This data is commercially necessary. Terminals need to plan crane operations. Customs needs to assess duties. Logistics coordinators need to arrange inland transport, but manifest data is also intelligence. Aggregate 14,000 vessels annually, and you can track U.S. military logistics patterns, consumer demand signals, strategic materials imports, pharmaceutical supply chains. You know what's being shipped, when it's arriving, and where it's going before it enters U.S. territorial waters. Hutchison's concession included the right to operate the terminal's information systems. That meant Chinese-linked operators controlled the databases logging every manifest. No backdoor hacking required. They had front-door access. Here's what this means for you. The entity controlling Panama terminal operations can identify which ships carry military cargo disguised as commercial freight, creating targeting intelligence for interdiction scenarios. They can track retail inventory flows to predict consumer spending patterns before U.S. companies report earnings. They can monitor pharmaceutical shipments to assess U.S. medical supply chain vulnerabilities, and they can delay or reroute containers to create artificial supply shortages that spike prices on everything from car parts to furniture. Once Hutchison controlled both terminals, Chinese shipping lines, Costco, and OOCL receive preferential fee structures and transit priority. Non-Chinese carriers face 12 to 18-hour longer queue times for canal passage, pushing cargo volume toward PRC-flagged vessels. This created secondary leverage. If you want predictable East Coast delivery schedules, you route cargo through Chinese carriers, giving Beijing visibility even if the shipper is American. You might be thinking, aren't port operations just commercial logistics? Every country's ports are operated by foreign firms. Dubai's DP World runs terminals from London to Sydney. Here's the problem with that assumption. Most ports have alternatives. If DP World's London terminal creates problems, cargo shifts to Felixstowe or Southampton. But Panama is a forced passage point. There is no alternative at comparable cost and transit time. That means whoever controls Panama terminals holds monopoly leverage over 40% of U.S. East Coast imports. And when that operator has PRC intelligence service links, cargo manifest data becomes a strategic vulnerability, not just commercial information. Britain's Suez Canal Company held a 99-year concession that seemed unbreakable until Egypt discovered the concession expired when sovereignty did. The 1956 nationalization worked because canal infrastructure cannot be relocated. Britain could deploy troops, but couldn't move the waterway to London. And that's just the geographical lever, lever 1. Lever 2 is where the contractual structure created the liquidation vulnerability. This is lever 2, contractual overreach. Here's the stakes. Chinese firms paid $600 million in 1997 for a 25-year concession that seemed to lock in terminal control until 2022. But concession agreements are not property ownership. They're regulatory licenses granted by sovereign authority. And what sovereignty grants, sovereignty can revoke. The trap Hutchison fell into, they structured the deal for maximum operational control, which meant maximum contractual vulnerability. 25 years is longer than most governments' political memory. Panama's leadership in 1997 granted the concession under different strategic conditions. Pre-9/11, pre-BRY, when Chinese logistics firm didn't trigger security reviews. By 2019, the political context had shifted entirely. Picture the concession document, 147 pages. Hutchison Ports Group as concessionaire, Republic of Panama as grantor. Page 89, section 12.4. Concession may be terminated by grantor if operations deemed to compromise national security or canal neutrality, as assessed by competent regulatory authority, with no compensation owed if threat criteria substantiated. When Hutchison's lawyers signed in 1997, this clause seemed like boilerplate political risk language, the kind of paragraph you include for domestic political cover but never enforce. But that single paragraph created the liquidation mechanism. If Panama declares a security threat, the $23 billion in terminal infrastructure becomes a stranded asset overnight. Here's how concession termination works without triggering expropriation claims. Under international investment law, governments can revoke licenses without compensation if they're responding to genuine security threats, not commercial disputes. The standard, proportionate regulatory action in response to substantiated national security risk. This is why the mechanism requires no buyout, no arbitration, no phase-out period. Panama doesn't claim the terminals are poorly operated or financially distressed. They claim the operator creates intelligence collection risk that compromises canal neutrality. A security determination that is legally unreviewable under the concession's own terms. The timing matters. Hutchison's concession was granted when China's overseas infrastructure footprint was minimal. By 2019, China had more than $1 trillion in BRR infrastructure investments globally, and U.S. intelligence agencies were documenting PLA links to civilian logistics firms. The regulatory environment Hutchison negotiated in 1997 no longer existed. But the 25-year concession locked them into contracts written for a different strategic era. Here's why this matters for your investments. If you hold stock in Chinese infrastructure developers, China Communications Construction Company, Costco Shipping Ports, China Merchants, Port Holdings, you're exposed to regulatory revocation risk across 60-plus countries. The Panama model establishes the template: invoke security review, terminate concession, install alternative operator, offer zero compensation. Your share value assumes long-term contract stability. But those contracts are vulnerable to unilateral cancellation. The moment host governments decide Chinese operational control creates intelligence risk. Once Panama terminates Hutchison's concession, other Western Hemisphere countries face a decision: keep Chinese port operators and risk U.S. security cooperation cuts, or void concessions and accept U.S. infrastructure financing as compensation. Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and Chile all have Chinese-operated ports or terminals. The precedent makes their contracts suddenly precarious. Not because of anything China did operationally, but because geopolitical alignment shifted underneath the concession terms. You might be thinking, Won't this discourage all foreign infrastructure investment if countries can void contracts whenever politically convenient? Here's the asymmetry. This mechanism works specifically against Chinese infrastructure because of documented PLA intelligence links to logistics firms. DP World APM terminals, PSA International, don't face the same vulnerability because they don't operate as extensions of state intelligence services. The liquidation risk is targeted, not universal. But if you're a Chinese state-owned enterprise, your concession is only as secure as the host government's relationship with Washington. When Britain negotiated the Suez Canal Company concession in 1869, they secured a 99-year operating monopoly that seemed eternal. By 1956, Egyptian leadership realized the concession was just a contract, and contracts can be voided by sovereign regulatory authority. The same mechanism that granted operational rights could revoke them. That was the contractual vulnerability, Lever 2. Lever 3 is the enforcement mechanism that made liquidation legally bulletproof. This is Lever 3, treaty enforcement without troops. Here's what this means for you. When the U.S. wants to liquidate foreign-controlled infrastructure without deploying the 82nd Airborne, they use treaty backdoors written decades earlier. The mechanism? 1977. Torrijos-Carter treaties that returned the Canal Zone to Panama. Every news story at the time focused on U.S. concession. We were giving up the canal. But buried in the text, Article 9, Neutrality Provisions. The U.S. retained the right to intervene if canal operations threaten hemispheric security or compromise neutral passage. This isn't military occupation authority. It's contractual enforcement rights embedded in Panama's foundational sovereignty documents. Picture a three-party contract. Party A, United States. Party B, Panama. Party C, terminal operators like Hutchison. The 1977 treaties defined the relationship between A and B. U.S. withdrew military bases but retained security oversight. Party C, terminal operators, signs concessions with Party B, believing they're just negotiating with Panama. But the concession operates within the constraints of the A-B treaty. If the U.S. tells Panama that Chinese terminal operations violate Article 9 neutrality provisions, Panama faces a choice: void the Hutchison concession or jeopardize the entire treaty relationship with the U.S. That's not a real choice. Here's the enforcement chain. First, U.S. intelligence briefs. Panama's government on security concerns regarding Hutchison's PLA intelligence links. This is documented via classified assessment reports that Panama's leadership reviews but never sees publicly. Second, Panama's regulatory agency, the Panama Canal Authority, initiates formal security review of terminal concessions under domestic regulatory powers. Third, the authority cites Article 9 treaty obligations as legal justification. Not U.S. pressure, but Panama's own treaty compliance responsibility. Fourth, Hutchison is given 30 days to respond to security threat findings. Fifth, authority terminates concession under Section 12, Repo.4, the clause allowing no compensation revocation for security threats. Sixth, alternative operators prepositioned by U.S., DP World, and APM assume operations within 90 days under new concessions. The brilliance: no U.S. military presence required, no overt diplomatic pressure visible, no arbitration exposure, because Panama is exercising domestic regulatory authority under its own concession terms. The treaty provides the legal architecture. Panama provides the sovereign enforcement. The U.S. provides the intelligence assessment that triggers the process. Here's why this matters beyond Panama. The U.S. has similar treaty relationships across the Western Hemisphere. The Rio Treaty, bilateral defense agreements with Colombia and Peru, and basing rights in Ecuador all contain neutrality or security cooperation clauses that allow U.S. intervention in infrastructure disputes. If you're tracking Chinese overseas investments, don't just read the concession documents. Read the underlying security treaties between host nations and the U.S. Those treaties are the enforcement mechanism that makes infrastructure liquidation legally defensible. Once the treaty backdoor is visible, Chinese infrastructure developers face new underwriting costs. Every BRI port project in a country with U.S. security treaties now carries forced liquidation risk. This isn't insurable. No political risk policy covers host nation, terminates concession under treaty compliance obligations. Chinese lenders start demanding sovereign guarantees from host nations, but those guarantees are worthless if the host nation's treaty obligations override commercial contracts. The cost of capital for Chinese infrastructure deals in U.S.-aligned countries spikes by 400 to 600 basis points. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. The treaty mechanism only works if Panama believes U.S. security guarantee is more valuable than Chinese infrastructure investment. If China offers $10 billion in new canal modernization financing plus diplomatic cover against U.S. pressure, Panama could refuse to terminate Hutchison's concession. The leverage depends on Panama's calculation of long-term strategic alignment, and that calculation can shift if U.S. commitment seems uncertain or Chinese economic offers become overwhelming. You might be thinking, if treaty backdoors let the U.S. void any foreign infrastructure deal, doesn't that destabilize all international investment? Here's the limit. The mechanism requires genuine security concerns, not just commercial competition. DP World operates U.S. port terminals and faces no treaty vulnerability because UAE doesn't run intelligence collection operations through logistics firms. The liquidation risk is specific to state-directed infrastructure that doubles as intelligence platforms. But if you're a Chinese state-owned enterprise, your treaty exposure is now the primary investment risk, not commercial performance. Britain tried to enforce Suez Canal concession rights militarily in 1956 and discovered expeditionary force deployment is expensive, unpopular, and ineffective when the host nation has superpower backing. Egypt won because they had treaty legitimacy. The 1888 Constantinople Convention guaranteed Egyptian sovereignty. The lesson: treaty mechanisms beat military enforcement. That's the legal enforcement mechanism, Lever 3. Lever 4 is where Panama's regulatory process provided political cover for what was effectively forced confiscation. This is Lever 4, regulatory pretext as liquidation mechanism. Here's the stakes for your portfolio. When governments want to seize foreign infrastructure without triggering arbitration, they use domestic regulatory authority as cover. The mechanism: Panama's Canal Authority has statutory power to review concessions for national security compliance and canal neutrality obligations. These are domestic regulatory functions, not treaty enforcement. So when Panama terminates Hutchison's concession, they're not acting under U.S. pressure, legally speaking. They're exercising sovereign regulatory oversight. The beauty of this structure, it converts geopolitical liquidation into routine administrative process. Picture Panama's regulatory filing. In raw security assessment of container terminal concessions, Balboa and Cristobal facilities, docket number A, CP-2019-047. Reads like bureaucratic procedure. Page 12. Authority finds operational security protocols insufficient to prevent unauthorized access to cargo manifest databases. Page 23. Authority determines concession holders' corporate structure creates unmitigable intelligence collection risk. Page 31. Authority hereby terminates concessions effective immediately under Section 12.4b, no compensation owed per security threat provisions. It's administrative law language, dry, procedural, technical. But the outcome is $23 billion in stranded assets, liquidated via regulatory decree. Here's why regulatory process provides legal insulation. Under international investment arbitration rules, governments can terminate contracts without compensation if they're exercising legitimate regulatory authority to address genuine security risks. The test: was the action arbitrary or discriminatory? Panama avoids this by framing the decision as security-based, not commercial. They're not claiming Hutchison breached contract terms or performed poorly. They're claiming the operator's PRC intelligence links create structural risk that no operational reform can eliminate. This makes the termination non-discriminatory, targeted at specific threat, not all foreign operators, and non-arbitrary, based on documented security assessment, not political whim. The regulatory review process creates procedural legitimacy. Hutchison receives notice, submits response, gets hearing before Canal Authority Board. The authority issues findings based on classified security briefings provided by U.S. intelligence that Hutchison cannot meaningfully contest because evidence is not disclosed. 30 days later, termination order published, no arbitration available, because concession's own terms allow security-based termination. No compensation owed because threat criteria met. Hutchison's only recourse: challenge Panama's security determination in Panamanian courts, where judges will defer to executive branch national security assessments. Here's why this matters if you're invested in emerging market infrastructure. Regulatory authority is the lowest cost liquidation mechanism governments have. No military deployment, no diplomatic crisis, no arbitration exposure. Just routine administrative process that happens to expropriate $23 billion in assets. If you hold Chinese infrastructure developer stocks or bonds, price in the risk that 60-plus countries with U.S. security ties can use similar regulatory mechanisms. Your investment assumes contract stability, but those contracts are terminable via administrative procedure the moment geopolitical alignment shifts. Once regulatory pretext is established as liquidation template, other governments copy the mechanism. Sri Lanka reviews Hambantota port concession under security protocols. Myanmar reviews Kyaukphyu port under neutrality obligations. Pakistan reviews Gwadar port under counterterrorism compliance. Each uses domestic regulatory authority as cover for geopolitically motivated contract termination. Chinese developers lose the ability to predict which investments are secure, because any concession becomes vulnerable to regulatory review the moment U.S. intelligence provides host governments with security threat briefings. You might be thinking, won't Chinese firms just sue under bilateral investment treaties, BITs, that protect against expropriation? Here's the trap. Most BITs have security exceptions that allow governments to take actions necessary to protect national security interests. Hutchison's Hong Kong structure might provide BIT coverage, but Panama can invoke security exception to block arbitration. And even if arbitration proceeds, it takes 5 to 7 years, during which alternative operators have already assumed terminal operations and Hutchison's assets have been fully liquidated. The legal process provides no practical recovery mechanism. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal Company in 1956 by decree, creating immediate expropriation claims from Britain and France. Panama learned from this mistake. Instead of nationalization, use regulatory review. Instead of confiscation, use concession termination under security provisions. Same outcome, zero compensation, but legally defensible under international investment law. That was the legal mechanism, Lever 4. Lever 5 is how the U.S. ensured Panama faced zero logistics disruption when Chinese operators were expelled, making the liquidation politically cost-free. This is Lever 5, instant operator replacement. Here's the risk that made liquidation viable. Panama couldn't void Hutchison's concession if it meant canal terminal collapse. 40% of U.S. East Coast imports depend on those terminals operating continuously. So before Panama initiated the security review, U.S. facilitated replacement operator negotiations with DP World, Dubai, and APM Terminals, Denmark. These firms received U.S. Ex-Im Bank financing commitments, regulatory pre-approval, and access to Hutchison's operational protocols. The message to Panama: you can terminate Chinese concessions without supply chain disruption, because alternative operators are ready to assume control within 90 days. Picture the transition timeline. Day 0. Panama issues termination order. Day 1 through 30. Hutchison legally required to continue operations during notice period. Day 31 through 60. DP World personnel arrive. Shadow Hutchison operations. Download terminal system protocols. Day 61 through 90. Formal handover. DP World assumes concession under new 15-year terms. Day 91. First container ship processed under non-PRC operator. 0 days of supply chain interruption. The replacement operator pool removes Panama's fear of logistics collapse, making the liquidation politically feasible. Here's why pre-positioned operators eliminate host government hesitation. Panama's primary concern isn't ideology, it's operational continuity. If voiding Hutchison's concession means months of terminal downtime, shipping lines divert to Colombian or Mexican ports, costing Panama $400 to $500 million in annual canal transit fees. But if DP World can step in immediately with comparable operational capability, Panama loses nothing by expelling Chinese operators. The U.S. structured the replacement process to make liquidation cost-free for Panama. Alternative operators pre-approved, financing pre-arranged, operational transition scripted. Panama just provides sovereign authority for concession transfer. Here's what this means for global supply chains. The U.S. has now demonstrated it can liquidate Chinese infrastructure without causing logistics disruptions. That emboldens other governments to consider forced divestment of Chinese port operators, telecom providers, and logistics firms. If you're a shipper dependent on Chinese-operated ports from Ecuador to Greece, price and the risk that operators could be replaced with zero notice under regulatory review mechanisms. Your logistics contracts assume operational continuity, but those operators are now exposed to instant replacement if security reviews proceed. Once replacement operator pools are visible, Chinese infrastructure firms lose competitive advantage. Previously, Chinese state-owned enterprises could underbid Western competitors by 20 to 30% using state subsidies, winning concessions on price. But if host governments know Chinese operators are replaceable within 90 days via US-backed alternatives, the switching cost drops to near zero. Why accept higher political risk from Chinese operators if DP World or APM will match pricing with US financing? The infrastructure competition rebalances toward Western firms. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, shipping companies panicked because Egyptian pilots lacked experience to navigate the channel safely. Britain predicted logistics collapse. Egypt hired Yugoslav and Soviet pilots within weeks, and the canal operated normally. The lesson: infrastructure liquidation only works if replacement operators are pre-positioned. Those are the 5 levers. The geographical monopoly created the intelligence vulnerability. The concession structure created the legal mechanism. The treaty backdoor provided enforcement authority. The regulatory pretext offered political cover. And the replacement operator pool eliminated logistics risk. Together, they liquidated $23 billion in Chinese infrastructure in 90 days with zero compensation paid. Here's why this template now threatens China's entire trillion-dollar overseas infrastructure portfolio. The 5 levers just reset the infrastructure competition. China spent 15 years positioning logistics firms at global chokepoints, believing long-term concessions guaranteed security. They didn't account for the treaty backdoors, the regulatory mechanisms, or the replacement operator pools that make liquidation cost-free for host governments. The Panama template now threatens $1 trillion in Chinese overseas infrastructure. Every port concession in a U.S. treaty partner is suddenly exposed to 90-day liquidation with zero compensation. The question isn't whether more forced divestments happen, it's whether China can recalibrate the BRI model before the next $50 billion in assets gets the same treatment.